the first article that we're going to be talking about here is why aren't smart people happier? And we can actually take a look at the source for this here. I'll jump into the source real quick. So this was a blog post from Experimental History on Substack, and it talks about how there is a, well-defined problems and not well-defined problems, and how intelligence doesn't necessarily make people happy because you might just be solving a poorly defined problem, which I find to be pretty interesting. This graph in particular is pretty interesting, where we get to see how, even though we've had a lot of technology exist from 1949 to 2019, the internet, for example, planes, rocket ships, the curing of smallpox in the 1970s, people aren't necessarily happier, right? There's also a lot more people, so there's that's a definite consideration I think that this graph needs to take into account. But I thought that this article was really good, and I thought that the blog post was just really, really smart. So I'm excited to kind of like talk a little bit more about like the notes that I highlighted, and maybe like disseminate a little bit into what I think is kind of interesting. So let's talk about this first one here. So if psychologists were ever to march into battle, a good candidate for our crest may be the famous Muller-Lyer illusion, the two lines that look like they're different lengths but aren't. So I thought this was kind of funny because, again, it kind of like talks a little bit about how the functions of like kind of like human psychology, and how we all perceive the world through kind of a perception of an illusion, right? Like there's no the way that the world is and the way that we perceive the world are very two different things, which is why we rely on scientific models to back up our claims when we think that something is either true or false. So being able to take a concept that doesn't really have a human defined shape, but then kind of like giving it a scientific term, and like gravity, for example, right, where it's like 9.8 meters per second squared for the acceleration of the earth, is like a very scientific, it's a very kind of like dense concept. But being able to understand that that's that the concept of how we thought that the world might work versus the way that the world does work are different, I just thought to be very interesting. So like looking at these lines, obviously it looks like an illusion where you can see that through with your eyes that it looks like the lines are different lengths. Mentally, if you're a shape rotator, I guess is the popular Twitter terminology right now, you could probably see that if you flip the top one's arrowheads, that it's just exactly the same line. But if you aren't paying attention to just the arrowheads, then like the little distance that the arrowheads add, you would think that the line is shorter for sure as well, because of the size of the whole thing. But it's interesting that the author said that if psychologists ever had to march into battle, a good candidate for our crest may be this illusion, right? Where it kind of like invokes the image of a bunch of like psychology people saying like like really trying to study the human perception engine and really trying to understand why people think that things look like a certain thing when they are actually another thing altogether. Kind of like I remember reading a lot about the behaviorism of the 1900s, like the behaviorist school of thought, which was really popular in campuses because of people like B.F. Skinner and the Skinner box and things like that, where people were just dead set on this idea that it was kind of like a birthing of the mind body dualism crowd, where they were able to say like, oh hey, if you are a human is just a subset of behaviors basically. And then psychology, I guess, evolved into being a little bit more based around kind of where we're at today, with a kind of like more cognitive behavioral therapy, where it still uses elements of behaviorism, but it also takes into account cognition, and how cognition is something that isn't really something that's like tractable or rational. that behaviorism worked because economists and scientists wanted it to work, right? It's very convenient, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later. It's very convenient if our models are well defined, but the world is a little bit less, the world isn't as well defined as we would desire for it to be. So I think that this is a good example of like, we desire for these lines to be at different lengths, and because they look like they're different lengths, but in reality they're not different lengths. So we have to update our kind of cognitive understanding of things to be able to engage better with the world. Gaze upon our works in despair. If you're familiar with Watchmen, you might know of Ozymandias. Hold on. Ozymandias picture. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, too vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing besides remain. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless yet bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So this kind of Ozymandias, this is Ozymandias from Watchmen, which I just watched the Watchmen 2019 series on HBO, and Ozymandias is, spoiler alert, I guess, for anyone who hasn't seen Watchmen, uses squids to basically murder 3 million people in New York City to prevent nuclear bombs from being dropped. And that he starts to basically fabricate this idea that it's an extra dimensional threat, but he's actually literally just teleporting these squids that he made from Antarctica into just random cities across the US, and kind of keeping people under the foot of feeling like, oh, we're all in this together against this extra dimensional kind of like threat, so we all need to work together to not destroy each other. And you know, this quote here is from actually Percy Shelley, who wrote this in his book Ozymandias, that was talking about how all empires eventually come to an end. And I think in particular he was talking about Ramses the Great. So I think in particular he was talking about this statue, which is, I think, Ramses the Great. Again, I have to go look again. Yes, it was about the pharaoh Ramses II, who was was Egypt's longest living pharaoh, lived well into his 90s, had like a bajillion children, was just a wild dude. And Percy Shelley here was referencing the fact that all empires eventually kind of like falter, and all empires eventually come to an end and crash on each other. So this kind of idea of making yourself a god is kind of worthless in the face of time. The way that this author uses it for why aren't smart people happier, talks about not just my works, but it talks about not my as in me, my as in like Ozymandias, talks about our work of humans, like what we've accomplished in the past 100 years. For example, like I had mentioned, we solved smallpox in the past 50 years, right? Like smallpox has been completely eradicated. If you see like a graph of smallpox, if you're looking at like a global number of reported smallpox over the past 100 years, right? So this is like 1920, which is like 100 years ago. There was 400,000 cases of smallpox, and that's actually probably a pretty chill year, all things considered, you know, given smallpox's history globally. And by 1980, the cases have gone down to 0, right? Across the whole world, right? Like everybody, smallpox has just been completely wiped out from the face of the planet. And smallpox was a huge thorn in the side of human flourishing. It was, you know, COVID times a bajillion, right? Like it killed in Athens, it killed upwards of 90% of the people that it infected, which is 9 out of 10 people, right? So like imagine feeling like, oh, like if you were playing those odds, that's really bad odds, right? You don't take those odds. So not even just smallpox, but the internet, like the internet is less than 100 years old too. You ever heard of these things called methods? No. What kind of methods? Also, hey Gabe, talking about ARPANET and the gaze upon our works in despair, why smart people aren't happy. You know, comp sci. Oh yeah. Functions and methods. Yeah, that's also a relatively recent invention, right? What do you think about here? I actually have a question for you. What do you think? Why do you think that smart people, like if you go in, you take an IQ test, for example, and you have a really high IQ, why do you think that high IQ people aren't happier than low IQ people? Like if you had to guess why somebody with like an IQ of 120, like what's preventing them? Because we focus on negatives. That's a good, yeah, I agree with that. I think that, well, I don't think it's just that. If you're highly educated, you understand more of humankind's problems. Yeah, well, because like here's an example though. Like if you really understood the problem of smallpox, you know that you can just eradicate it, right? So like let's say that you had a family member, like, and you were in 1955 and 300,000 people got smallpox. So like even if you were just focusing on the negative, it was a very real negative, right? Like your family is actually dying of smallpox, but you also know that there is an immunization happening, effort happening with the CDC in Atlanta at this time, right? allowing them to kind of like maybe move forward. So I don't know if it's just the negatives thing. I think that that is a big perception aspect where people are definitely focused on like something that will upset them as opposed to something that would make them feel better, or at least not bad. But I think actually the problem is that smart people still can't solve unwell-defined problems, right? So like, you know, later on in this piece, the author talks about his grandmother, where he says, my grandma doesn't know how to use the input button on her TV's remote control, but she does know how to raise a family of good people who love each other, how to carry on through a tragedy, how to make the perfect pumpkin pie. We sometimes condescendingly refer to this kind of wisdom as folksy or homespun, as if answering multiple choice questions is real intelligence and living a good full life is just some down home gee whiz cutesy thing that old ladies do. And I think about this from that perspective too, where I think negativity is more of a reflection on how people refuse to solve problems, right? Or they see the problems and then don't come up with a solution for it, because if anything, it's actually quite pragmatic to solve problems, right? Like if you see that you have dishes in the sink, your choices are, I can just get depressed about the dishes in the sink, or I can do them, or I, you know, figure out to use less dishes in the future, right? So I don't know if it's just negativity, even though I will agree that I think highly educated people tend to ruminate more because they feel like they probably have been told at a very young age that they're really good at solving things. And when they can't solve a problem that's like really deeply seated in their consciousness, they feel like a failure, even more so than a person who might think that they're stupid, because a person who thinks that they're dumb wouldn't bother to like worry about it, right? Like they would just be like, yeah, I'm just dumb. Like I leave that to God or whoever, right? Like I leave that to something bigger than me that's going to solve that. And I think that this kind of talks a little bit about like, you know, even being the most powerful person in an era like a Ramesses II, where you could literally walk around as a god. He still died, I think, in a pretty painful fashion. I think he got like gout or something like that. I mean, he was late into his 90s and he probably would have had atherosclerosis and a bunch of other things anyway by that point. So he lived a very full life. But the kind of willingness to accept that some problems aren't well-defined problems that you can just fix, some problems are yet to be defined problems, and being able to, I think, delineate between the two is important for being happy, or at least not being unhappy. But thank you for answering. I think that's a good point. So like this part of the article was also really interesting to me, where it was talking about the current state of GPT and the current state of kind of like artificial intelligence, and how artificial intelligence is probably not as smart as we give it credit for, at least in the traditional sense of smart. And I, you know, work in this space a lot, but this in particular was an interesting quote. If you booted up a super smart AI in ancient Greece, fed it all of the human knowledge of the time, and asked it to how to land on the moon, it would respond, you can't land on the moon. The moon is a god floating in the sky. So how would you get it to actually realize that the moon is actually a big rock is a really interesting question, right? Because that is the aspect, I think, of human creativity that's really valuable, right? So human creativity has to be counterbalanced by the reality of things in the real world to come up with solutions to major problems. So again, this smallpox example that I've been hammering over and over, smallpox was basically just a way of life for people for centuries and thousands of years. People just assumed that half of the people, and mostly children, who would get smallpox would just die, right? Like that was just how it was, until a doctor immunized a boy with cowpox in the 1700s in France. And that was a creative act, right? Like he was able to creatively come up with a way to say like, oh, hey, this is now a way to cure people of this ailment. But then given the fact that people were like, okay, so this works, right? Like we've turned this from a not well-defined problem where we don't know how to solve smallpox and it's just ravaging through societies, to a well-defined problem where it's like, if we immunize people, then even if we expose them to smallpox, they won't get smallpox. So how do we immunize as many people as possible against smallpox, which became another creative problem, but also just a lot of boots on the ground, sending people to Africa, sending people to Asia in the 1950s, sending people across Europe to this point here where you can see that this is actually kind of tragic, right? Like being on this little bump here sucks the most for smallpox, right? Because you are the last bastion of smallpox death in the world thus far. Obviously, maybe it'll come back. I don't have a future globe. Apparently, at least from what I can divine from the internet, smallpox only exists in two places on the world right now, is Siberia and Atlanta, and it's contained. So we'll see how that goes for the future, but it's interesting to see how that kind of played out, right? That involved a lot of creativity where you would have to change the way that human knowledge works. So you need to say like, okay, so no, currently we do think like this, but we're wrong. Right? Like we aren't correct. But why aren't we correct? And if we do find a solution that works and is cheap and is available and we can rapidly spread it, how do we do that? And I think that this idea of kind of well-defined problems got me thinking a lot again about like the stuff that we try to accomplish on this stream with this obsidian work, where a lot of PKM I think is the process of taking knowledge and turning it from this kind of like amorphous blob of notes and over adding a structure to it after the fact, and then using that structure to both justify and strengthen the claim of what the ideas are trying to say. So a lot of this feels, like I said, a lot like improv, which is one of the reasons that I love doing it. It feels like as I'm coming up with these ideas, I can kind of like see where the boundaries of these ideas lie, go and fetch new resources to either add to the idea or maybe change the idea, evolve the idea. But it's really interesting. So that was pretty much that article, actually. I think that pretty much covers the why aren't smart people happier, which is really cool. And I actually am going to copy this. I wonder if I could just paste it. Amazing. Scala Draw is amazing. This app freaking rocks, bro.